Hello, everyone. It's Patricia Warby from Alchemy Therapies and my emotional audit. And I just today wanted to talk about the many lives of Lee Miller. And actually, it's been made into a film called Lee, simply Lee, starring Kate Winslet. And in fact, she was very involved in the production and in getting the director involved. She's been trying to make the film for, I think, at least the last 10 years. It may even be longer. And it's finally come out this week and really illustrates some of the principles and ideas that I'm promoting on this channel about how past experience informs the rest of your life. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Lee. Now, first of all, it's a really, really good film. Don't believe some of the reviews, which I think, it's the usual story. Anything made with a woman's gaze is often devalued, demoted, because this is a really personal story about a woman who really struggled to assert her professional independence, I guess. She lived at a time when women were largely regarded as passive and the recipients of the male gaze, I guess you could say. She was a model for Vogue magazine, and she was also a muse for some of the early surrealists, the group of artists, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. So looking from kind of the 1910s to the 1920s and 30s. But she actually developed with Man Ray, who you will have heard of course, because Man Ray was her lover, and then he was the mentor, if you like, taught her photography. But she then developed with him a technique called solarization, which is something you may have seen in photographs from that period, where there's a sort of glow around the image. And it was a chemical technique to kind of enhance the look of the photo, but it was definitely half of Lee's idea, but you'll never hear her credited, or very seldom. Maybe that'll change now with the film and the understanding. So she started as a model, and she decided after a while that she wanted to be behind the camera and not in front of the camera. And so she developed her abilities as a photographer. And then the war came along and really transformed the lives of people, because she was actually an American but living in London with her partner, who was Roland Penrose, who was also very involved in the surrealist movement. He was an artist himself, but he largely organized exhibitions and helped promote the work of other artists. So that was his big kind of focus. So when they met, she went to live with him in London. So she was an American living in London at the time the war broke out, and women were not expected or encouraged to do anything other than kind of maybe volunteer for being an air raid warden or becoming a nurse, maybe. Over that got you over, but she wanted to take photographs. She wanted to become a war correspondent, and that was not allowed. Until she found a sort of loophole, which was that the American government would pay for her, where the British government would block every attempt she made to go over. So eventually she got sent over to Europe to report on the war. And it took such a long time that the war was kind of in its final stages. It was 1944 when she got over to Europe, and the film really shows you the devastation of war and what personal danger she was actually subjected to taking her photos. She did, in fact, she was one of the first women to be present at the liberation of the concentration camps as well. And some of her photos from there are so horrific. And her experience was so horrific. She was traveling with a Jewish photographer who was a personal friend, and the film accurately depicts his terrible awareness that these were largely Jewish people who had been exterminated. So I think the trajectory of the film focuses on the kind of 10 years before and during during the war and her experiences there. But it has a very interesting structure in that it's recounted by an older Lee, also played by Kate, talking to a young man who you're not sure who he is, but he seems to be inquiring about her life. So he could be a journalist, he could be a writer. I'm not going to give away the ending there because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen the film, but there is a twist at the end about that. So she's recounting her life, and you're seeing in flashback the actual experience. But what I wanted to cover, apart from her genius, you know, she was a fabulous photographer. If you ever want to check out her photographs, then buy The Lives of Lee Miller, which is written by her son, Anthony Penrose. They are beautifully composed. She just had an eye for it. But obviously, this isn't a channel that talks about film reviews. What I really wanted to cover was why it was she ended up wanting to go to the worst place on earth at that time, which was Europe, in the aftermath, in just the final days of the German withdrawal. And if you focus on perhaps one detail that's mentioned in the film, but it's a minor detail in the film, but it's a very, very significant one, and I'm really glad they covered it, was that Lee is shown defending women quite often. She prevents a rape. She obviously, through her professional life, photographs a lot of women who were involved in the war, which wouldn't have happened if she hadn't been a woman, because most male photographers didn't regard women as suitable subjects, not in combat. So she did defend women, and the reason was, you find out that she was actually sexually abused at the age of 7 by a family friend, I guess you'd say, someone who came into the family to look after her, because she was separated from her mother at this point. Her mother was very ill, was taken to hospital, and she went to live with family friends. And then there was a man who came into that household who abused her. Her mother, when she told her mother, said, "You must never talk about that." And so she never did, until finally it's revealed in her diaries. And she's telling this young man who's inquiring about her life. And so you see that everything that she did, from this absolute conviction that she had to run towards danger and not away from it, she was absolutely drawn to traumatic environments, which is so common with people who've had childhood trauma, because it feels familiar. It's like that buzz of adrenaline feels absolutely, you're at home there. And so you're very at home with conflict, but you're very ill at ease with vulnerability. And so it's an extraordinary thing that somebody who's had a difficult experience at one point in their life should be affected to such a high degree in later life. And what we see is that this difficulty with dealing with vulnerability affected her relationships throughout her life. Although she was with Roland a long time, she did have other relationships, and it being the 1930s, 40s, it was sort of a common thing that people would move, particularly people of her class and the artistic community, would move around into different relationships. And so she was by no means a simple homebody. And I think that's what she struggled with eventually when the war ended. And this intensity of experience became something that was now over, and she was expected to go home and play house. And that's kind of wasn't in her DNA. She had a son, as I've said, Anthony, but it wasn't something she was at home with. His vulnerability as a child maybe triggered her. I'm not sure. She agreed that she wasn't a great mother. You know, there was lots of struggle. There was lots of difficulty as well from a coping strategy that, of course, post the trauma of the war, she would undoubtedly have been classed as traumatized. Now she used alcohol as a soothing device and became a functional alcoholic. And so her child, Anthony, grew up in that environment. Now, that's not to say she didn't achieve other things in her life. She became a cordon bleu cook and writer, obviously. Her photographs were enough of a fame to keep her well supported in life, particularly her photographs for American Vogue. That they became so famous because they were the first ever to reveal the horrors of the war. And so, although she didn't continue so much with photography, she didn't give it up entirely. She did become a very just expert cook and somebody who created a life. But it wasn't enough for her, I think, is key. And I think her son suffered from that hugely. And so he recounts that he felt blamed, that he ruined his mother's life just by existing. And this is what I often see with clients who come and work with me, is that their parent, usually mother or father or both, struggles to raise the child with emotional empathy because they are in denial of their own vulnerability, or their vulnerability was squashed or attacked in some way through trauma of some kind. So the parental trauma impacts the child. And so I think the power of the film really is in seeing this intense experience that Lee went through and how that metabolized itself in her system and how that affected the relationships, including the relationship with her child. And we see it from his point of view as well, in that he never really felt cherished or loved in the way he needed. And so I think this is a good example of how what we call adverse childhood experiences do live on in the body. They create patterns of response which may deny and deflect and dissociate from emotional connection because it doesn't feel safe, or it doesn't feel safe to love another person wholeheartedly. It doesn't feel safe to be in your life wholeheartedly. You may dissociate parts of your body or your experience. You may go numb or check out, and that's how I lived the first 40 years of my life, thinking I'm perfectly functional and my life is good and I'm a highly achieving person, but not realizing how dissociated and disconnected I was from my body. And so it's well worth knowing that there are tools and techniques now which can reverse this problem and rewrite the patterning in the nervous system that has become ingrained as a pattern or habit of response to emotionally charged situations. And in my view, the best way is through somatic sensory work, which is what I do. So I engage the body in its responses to experience to help overwrite the program. It's not enough to simply talk about it. This is why talk therapy seldom works in trauma. You have to allow the body to speak and connect with the body's understanding, which, if that sounds a little strange to you, the body actually connects via the vagus nerve and the spinal nerve to the back of the brain. And so it's rewriting your unconscious responses as well as, dealing with some of the traumatic imprints. So it is scientifically upheld, actually, this understanding, but it might sound a little strange to those of you who've never come into or heard of somatic work, is that we are rewiring unconscious process instead of conscious process, which is what you use when you're talking to somebody about your trauma. And so it isn't even necessary to remember what traumatized you. You may have been too young. It's only sufficient to engage with the feeling in the body when it arises. Now, I'm going to stop there because I've covered in a lot of other videos what you then do and why and how the body remembers. But I thought I would use the understanding of Lee Miller and her extraordinary and sometimes painful experience to show you that everything can be shifted. Unfortunately, Lee didn't have that approach, wasn't available in her lifetime. But I want to give you all hope that it is entirely possible to rewrite the experience that lives on in you. You can't change the past, but you can change your response to it. Okay, well, if any of that sounds of interest, please get in touch. See my book, Mind Medicine, just released now on Amazon in various formats. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.